Thank you for having me here today. And I'm here, it's interesting how much of what I'll talk about was already touched upon early this morning. The world of online scholarly catalogs is very similar to some of the issues that the WPI has been dealing with catalog raisonnés, as I will demonstrate. So I'm really here to talk about museum publishers and how the new sort of newish realm of online scholarly catalogs is really pushing us to re-examine our role, our relationship to other people within our institutions, other departments, and our relationships with each other. It is a field that's typically quite convention-bound, and I think we are increasingly having to consider the contents of our publications as content, as we all like to talk about today, and really as data with context, which has a number of consequences for how we do our work. There are so many museums doing exciting things, and I don't pretend to be an expert in all of the projects across the field, but I hope to just give a kind of top-level overview, particularly for some people from the technology realm who might not be familiar with these projects, to kind of some of the questions that we're all facing, and use a little bit of a deeper dive into our own publication to bring some of these questions into focus. So just for those of you who might not be familiar with these types of catalogs, collection catalogs have been a staple of museum publishing for many, many years. Museum publishers generally have concentrated on collection catalogs or on exhibition catalogs. And a staple of the collection realm is the systematic catalog, which ideally is kind of giving you a slice of a comprehensive slice of an area of the collection, and giving you information that's object-based, with exhaustive information about a given object or artwork, images, basic tombstone information, references, exhibition histories, conservation images, and the like. These publications are generally a closed system, worked on over years and years with a kind of authorial and editorial team to create a kind of perfectly polished publication at the end. I'm showing an example here I worked on when I was at the Art Institute of Chicago that was published eventually in 2007. I recall working on entries that were on mimeographed sheets coming from the object files that have been referenced that were written literally in the 1980s. I got the content from the curator. We worked over years to make it perfect into this beautifully designed catalog. If that content ever made it back into City, which was the collections database that the Art Institute uses, I have no idea. It was not my problem. But even at that time, these sorts of publications were starting to feel antiquated. They're very expensive, partly due to low print runs. They immediately become out of date. If the goal is that we have every exhibition and we have every article, and then somebody publishes one, right as you're going to press, it's out of date. And also, this was a time when museums were starting to push their previously behind a firewall object files onto online databases. So it started to kind of push on the boundaries of, what is the value of these as these other things are starting to become available. So into that realm, the Getty Foundation launched the Online Scholarly Catalog Initiative in 2009. The Getty had been a major funder of these types of print publications, and I think they were saying, like, okay, with all of these things in mind, should we be considering things differently? How can we leverage the kind of new digital era? They started with 9 pilot projects, giving them seed funds to explore a variety of different platforms. And that resulted in a number of really varied projects from, the Art Institute of Chicago's at the top here, which was on Monet. This is an example of the Rauschenberg research project from SF MoMA. They really kind of ranged from essentially trying to mirror as much as possible the kind of layout of a print publication that you can page through while giving you options for zoomable images and other things, to something that really is much more database driven. It is separate from the collections database, but it has that interface and kind of is packaged differently. And these offered kind of, offer different opportunities and push different questions. It's very clear that you're in a publication at the top. it's maybe less clear to a user that you're in a publication at the bottom. What constitutes the difference in kind of quality or type or expectations? Part of what, the difference between perfection versus access. What is it that people will trust about something? I have a different expectation going to a collections database where maybe it's better that there's a crummy archival image from storage to represent something versus my expectation going into a vetted scholarly publication, which has the latest research and I can trust that this is the best representation of this object, et cetera. And it really kind of also just pushed on, the metaphor of the book for all of us. So OSCE presented a final report, and which is still available online, extremely useful and interesting. I remind myself about it to look at it all the time. And there's tons of findings for it. I pulled out a couple of top-level things that it seemed relevant kind of for this gathering, most relevant for this gathering today. And one thing that was not a foregone conclusion in going into it was, yes, people will actually consult these and trust them. I mean, this was a question going in of like, will scholars consult things that aren't print? And they kind of had to get over that. Just again, going back to museum and technology worlds being very different. But it also really pushed what a lot of the institutions discovered while they were working on these projects is that they really had to radically rethink their workflows, their staffing, the skill sets that they had. And really you had to start thinking about things and reversing in many ways the sort of editorial process and the way that you think about gathering things. And it's not as much about let's work on getting all of this stuff clean for this perfect thing. It's about how can we start thinking about the content as being independent from the particular platform or the particular package that it might be going into, and really kind of working on making sure that the underlying stuff works. So into this, I followed the OSCE project with great interest while I was working at the Carnegie Museum of Art, but didn't have an opportunity to work on an online publication until I joined the PMA. I was thrilled that this project was underway when I arrived in 2017, which was the John G. Johnson Collection, History and Selected Works publication. It was project managed by Karina Rachko from the Library and Archives, who is here today, working with curator Chris Atkins as the kind of leads on that project. And it comprises approximately 60 object entries and 6 long-form essays on works from the Johnson Collection, which is includes some of the most significant Old Master paintings housed at the PMA. And it has a few features that are kind of interesting that will point to some of the tensions that were kind of framed at the beginning. So it is. If you go into it, you have kind of, big image at the top. You have some content from on kind of the tombstone information, which is actually pulled via an API from our content management system, TMS. There is also digitized archival content, which is a big part of Karina's role in her team. They digitized all of the Johnson papers, so this is an endnote actually from one of the entries. You click on this, Bernard Berenson to John G. Johnson, and you actually get the scanned letter that you can consult yourself. We used IIIF to serve up the images. We included Oxford art links to artist biographies, so trying to kind of leverage some sources outside of the institution. We also used digital object identifiers, which you can't really see here, which essentially will make sure that the publication and the pages will be findable if the URL changes in the future, addressing issues of citability and permanence that we know are of importance to our scholarly audience. And David Newberry, who is the mastermind behind the structure of our catalog, please don't cringe too deeply at my massive oversimplification of the process, but our publication is an interesting hybrid in that it was developed to keep the editorial workflows with the authors kind of intact and comfortable for as long as possible. So texts are edited in Word in a sort of traditional way. And editors would add short codes using the comment function of Word, which you can see here, that would reference things like where images needed to be pulled in, cross-references to the objects in the archives and the like. The Word documents were paired with a metadata spreadsheet, which the editor is also responsible for kind of maintaining. And those things were run through a custom pipeline along with image information and, as we said, the information from TMS, which is, you can see a kind of screenshot there, to create the JSON files that were actually used to build the resulting page over there. Any changes to the publication that therefore are made to these source files, you go back to the Word doc if you see that there's a mistake in the thing, in the text here. And regardless of whatever the presentation package is, you have all of the kind of raw elements together to produce whatever you might lead to. So this integration of collections content is really exciting, and but posed a number of complications because the publishing department does not edit nor have the ability to edit content in TMS. So here we're seeing a screen grab of in the comparative image viewer of a work from our collection and a work from that's a comparative illustration. This caption was edited by an editor in my department according to our style guide. This caption was generated by pulling it via the script from TMS, from the various fields in TMS. There are various nails on the chalkboard type things in this caption that you probably can't really see, but namely, TMS doesn't support italics, which our editor wasn't aware of until she had edited every single other caption in the book to use italics for the titles. TMS doesn't have end dashes and inclusive dates, which, again, drives us crazy. So these things kind of pull to, and this is just a very, minor example. But I mean, just imagine kind of our terror as we sat thinking about this of what if imagine a scenario in which a fellow has gone in and said, I've researched this, and actually I really think that this is not by the follower of Donatello anymore. This is by Donatello. We're gonna change this attribution. They change it in TMS. Does anybody remember that we have this in an online publication? This is now changed in the online publication, but the whole narrative still talks all about how this can't be securely attributed to Donatello because of X, Y, and Z. So this is, a lot of things that we then had to kind of, once we built it, then really work through, we don't have a system to deal with this. Our departments have not had to deal with this. Going back to the era of the Art Institute publication where it was who knows what it says in the database? I don't care, the book is done, it's on the shelf. So, and then, just kind of a demonstration of this. This is a publication from a number of years ago, produced by the PMA. This is the object record in TMS. This is that same object that's in our collections database. Going back to some of the stuff that Caitlin started to speak about, or that rather was talked about at the very top around kind of the people who need to be brought along in these things. This publication was called, when I inherited my predecessor's object files, there was a big folder that was called Carl. I was like, what is Carl? And it's all caps. And it was the author of this publication is called Carl Strelke, who's a previous, he's a curator emeritus now, an expert in this. And he wrote, this is his an early Italian painting catalog, and that was what it was called in our official, it was Carl's book. And if Carl was very specific about how he wanted Siena first documented 1278, blah, 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 to be, that was how it was. But when we're in this world, we have to pull from here. And everybody in the institution needs to agree on how that information is presented. And there are limits on how it can be presented. It's structured. There might be a character limit. Like, these are things that then we have to say, this can't just be a sort of authorial decision, it's an institutional decision, which requires kind of discipline, empathy, style guides, and shared standards. A style guide is also something that we did not have when I started at the museum. So I'll kind of end this, my talk, by just pulling back out of the weeds of this particular publication to return to kind of the larger questions and how some of these might play out, as I've kind of hinted at already. So one thing that was really interesting, and kind of go back to, return to Oski in a certain way, you know, we launched this publication. We're working on improving our platform and planning for the future publications. And as part of that, we wanted to do an assessment. We discovered last year that the Art Institute, the National Gallery of Art, and the Getty and Getty Publishing were also all interested in doing a study of their own online scholarly catalogs. Then we decided to go in on one together, which was very exciting. It is published online. You can see a link there if you want to check it out. It's very detailed. Basically, just very briefly, this study was intended to look at the needs and expectations of our target audiences, to look at who was using them or not, how they were finding them. It was based on email and intercept surveys, analysis of Google Analytics data, and in-depth focus groups. And I'll just kind of point out a few of the kind of top-level findings. There's a lot in there that I think have been kind of framing my thinking, and that I think have just these broader implications that could be of interest to the group and people just beyond museum publishing. One thing is that really it is heartening. One thing, people were very positive, which was great. People were using them. They embrace them. They feel that these types of publications are extremely useful, specifically for museums to create something that is based around sort of the object, that they recognize that museums are in a unique position and have the resources to examine, study, provide information about. So, you know, just for our point of view in terms of where we would continue to put our emphasis, it really is probably going to be continuing to go around these object-based things as opposed to sort of monographic presentations or other things and the like. The issue of context came up, and in a couple of different ways. Where is this, as well, the lines can often blur between an online scholarly catalog and an online collections database. There is still a distinction in people's minds and in our target audience of researchers, and that they do look to the publications to be contextualizing, interpretive, critical, that there is expertise in drawing out connections and making arguments. The issue of context also came up in a different way, in kind of like highlighting the context in which the moment in which this thing is produced. Because some of the fear can be around, if the promise of these things is that you can update them and you can kind of constantly keep them updated over time. There's a quote over here from a conservator who's kind of saying, well, we look at these historical resources to kind of dig through and understand how things have changed over time, how images have changed, how perceptions have changed. And if we are updating them and not being clear about when we're updating them, not giving people markers for when we've made decisions to change things, is that kind of losing a part of the historical record? And so really that comes to kind of developing and communicating clear versioning protocols for these sorts of publications. A number of people in the focus groups were just kind of like why does everything have to be different? Just like put the button in the same place, you know, like why are you, you know, and this is just some of the stuff that shows like the tool findability for each of the publications, and you know, some obviously people were able to find things easier than others. And you know, this is obviously easier said than done. People have invested in, there's legacy platforms. Again, there are people involved. But also kind of, there were some things that seemed to be, trends that are general preferences, but within even the focus groups, you could get people on totally different sides in terms of what type of publication they preferred or what interface they preferred. People are still different and emerging and have different working styles. I think that what we're trying to do, among the group of museums that did these is really try to pick out, like, what are the things where we see that there are clear, clear sort of winners in terms of a means of presenting something that we can then, steal and use as we're developing, like, okay, people really responded to this way of downloading an image much better. Let's see if we can pull that in and just try to learn from each other kind of on that level. And then, the other thing that a lot of people said, which is obviously kind of, speaking to the larger issues that gathers us here today, is, the expectations of a connectivity, the expectations that people have in going online, that they will be able to make these connections between things. Internally within our publication, as I mentioned, we have a number of internal connections with archival data, the archival database, with TMS. We have links to artist biographies and art online, of Oxford Art Online. People in the study called out that they really liked that the Getty took advantage of actively calling out images and using things pulled from the commons in their online publication. But this required, but there are risks that I think we are self-evident. I probably don't really need to talk about them, but fragility, dependency, the lack of control. Like, these publications have traditionally all been about control. It has been Carl, and like, Carl doesn't like it if somebody changes something in something that his publication is linked to. And so, and also, it really changes where we as publishers, how we have to think about staffing ourselves and thinking about where the publication ends. It never ends in these. If the expectation is that you will be responding, that it means that once in the past, once that that Art Institute of Chicago book has sat on my shelf. And it is never going to be reprinted. It could be that someday there could be a reprint or a revised edition, in which case we'd pull out the errata sheet and we'd update all of those things and we'd do it. But otherwise, you can just put it there and move on to the next one, which really is, we now no longer have that luxury. And we still, it's a big challenge for me and my department as we work on launching ever more of these, is really being realistic about what that role is going to be in the future. So with that, I'll kind of end the whirlwind tour. And I hope that just gives a little bit of a taste of kind of a lot of the issues, at least in our realm, that touch upon things that I think many of you in the room are also considering. And I look forward to getting lots of inspiration from the rest of you to help us power through to the next stage of our work. So thank you.